So this idea of deliberate practice is that it matters so much more. Certainly the amount of practice that we do, how much we train, it's a factor. I know that. In my current life stage, getting enough training time is always a challenge. But what's more important than how often you practice or how much you practice is how that practice, how that training is done. So do you just do a whole bunch of heeling, or do you isolate a specific component, left turns, right turns, about turns, identifying what's weakest in your dog, the transition from normal to fast, the transition from fast to normal? Is it your halts? Finding that one piece, pulling it out and practicing that, and finding ways to enhance that aspect of it. It's the how you practice that matters the most. And this is really, again, really, I can't emphasize this enough. We have a tendency to want to look at the whole thing. We want to zoom out. We want to practice heeling and just walk around in circles. Most of the traditional obedience, competition obedience, well, we'll separate this from pet obedience, but, experiences can be similar there. Most of the traditional club-based competition obedience classes that I have personally attended have a lot just heeling your dog around in the circle. There's not this aspect of deliberate practice. There's not this isolation, this focus on something specific. And when we look at elite performers in any sport, in any field, this ability or this focus is what makes the difference between the people who are getting by and the people who are really progressing. It's looking for, what's the weakest link. Right now, with my dog, my little terrier Rugby, if I look at his healing, so I'm talking about that, I like to talk about healing a lot. The weakest link in his healing is his transition from normal to fast. He tends to have some little latency there. He tends to swing a little bit wide. So that's the best place for me to put my energy. I don't need to practice a whole lot of halts because his halts are pretty freaking good. I don't need to practice whole obedience patterns because that would only give me one opportunity to practice that transition from normal to fast. So I need to look at what's that weakness? I need to invent some specific tasks. In dog training jargon, we might call that a game. Some games to address that, to work on that specific skill and build on that. Because just repetition over and over again is pointless. So and this is something, honestly, that I've always been a fan of as a former human athlete and now as a member of a human dog athlete team. But in where I currently am, I'm a mom, I have animals, probably too many animals. I have a small business. I don't have enough time to train. So when I do train, I need to make sure that those minutes are used really effectively. I need to squeeze every last drop of juice out of that. So just repeating over and over again is not helpful. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice just makes permanent, right? So we need perfect practice. You need to use those practice minutes to improve a specific skill. So looking for the challenges and being as specific as possible. So I want to address a little bit this human tendency. We really like testing. So in this human sports world, there's this idea of the difference between drilling versus scrimmaging. And I feel like this needs a definition because when I talk to people in the dog sports world, we think of drilling as more like this kind of militaristic, repetitive, joyless, onerous task of just doing the thing over and over and over again. And that's the complete opposite of what is usually meant in the sports world. But I think it's an interesting parallel and it's worth digging into, even with that slightly confusing terminology. So in the sports world, a drill, and this is all honestly true in the military world as well, but a drill is a specific exercise. It's a game that has been designed to focus on some specific piece of a behavior, how fast you move your feet, how much you bend your knees, moving quickly from side to side, passing the ball, those little games that are not the full performance. So if we're looking at a football player, right, you may practice catching the ball. You may practice catching the ball while running. You may practice running to the left and jumping up and catching the ball. I hate that I always trap myself in these sports metaphors because this is certainly not my area of expertise. But if you or if your kids have participated in any kind of sport, you'll know that they spend most of their time practicing these little isolated skills with specific activities, dribbling around cones, for example. They don't spend their whole time playing pretend games. In the dog training world, the tendency, and I don't think this is just a dog training world, I think this is a human nature thing, and I think human sports are just a little bit ahead of us in this, but there is this tendency to want to train the dog by doing a lot of pretend dog shows. And so what that translates to in the dog world is the difference between splitting the behavior down and doing these games, working on these behaviors versus doing run-throughs. So again, the drill, the splitting, isolates a specific aspect of it. The run through practices the whole exercise or the whole performance. The problem is that slows learning. So if we go out there and do a healing pattern or do a rally run through or we do an obedience run through, yes, you'll do the whole big picture, but it doesn't actually buy you that much. In fact, it can slow down skill acquisition. So run-throughs are tough. Again, this is our natural. We look at obedience, we see obedience looks like this. It looks like I do all of the things, I do the healing around, I listen to the judge, I stop, I turn, I go faster, I go slower, I throw the dumbbell, my dog gets it, I do the jump, I do all of the things. And that very much fulfills our human need to test, to poke it with a stick. And I'm not completely against that. I do think there's a place for a little bit of testing to know where your training is. And that is really what I use dog shows for. The problem is the larger the sequence of behaviors, the more of the chunk of the run through, the more the chunk of the performance you're practicing, you are reducing the number of quality reps. So for example, if I go do a healing pattern run through with rugby, and I know that the fast pace, specifically the transition up to fast pace from normal, is his weakest spot, and I do a 2-minute run through with him, maybe a 2-minute obedience run through, I have a judge call all the exercises for me. But in 2 minutes, I rehearse going from normal pace to fast pace one time. That's pretty wasteful of his energy. And I joke about it, but it's not really a joke. Rugby has, according to his union, 12 minutes of acceptable training time per week. And so if I use 2 of those to get 1 repetition of his weakest exercise, I only get 6 of those and I'm done. I'm done for the whole week and I have to start again next week. And during that time, I may be untraining some of the other things. So that's not ideal. We want reinforced repetition is what helps skill acquisition. So the more times you rehearse the thing and get reinforced for the correct performance in the shortest amount of time without expending extra time or energy elsewhere, that's going to get you progress faster. The other problem with testing yourself, testing your training through run-throughs or run-through-like training sessions, or even dog shows, is it tends to distort our priorities. When we go in there, we do the whole thing, we have a harder time isolating what we need to work on. And it tends to encourage shortcuts. The number of times I've had a student come to a lesson or come to a seminar and say, well, I'm hear what you're saying of how to improve this problem, but I really just need to get through this weekend. He just needs 1 more leg to finish his open title, and then we can take time to work on his confidence and focus. Except for, why is it taking so long to get that last leg of his title? Well, because he's really struggling with confidence and focus. Well, now we've got a little bit of a problem, right? So the more we focus on the testing, on the run-throughs, on the dog shows, the more priorities get distorted. It also encourages us to judge success by what's on the score sheet rather than by what is learned. I mentioned earlier that I've had some runs that didn't look on paper particularly great. The score was not amazing. It was average or even maybe just an NQ, but the performance itself was excellent. There may have been one small error. Maybe my dog ran out to the Sin article pile and searched the whole thing with confidence, but accidentally picked up the article that was right next to the correct one and came back with the wrong article. The whole rest of his run was sharp. He was connected with me. His healing was enthusiastic and accurate. His responses to all of my cues were perfect, but he brought back that one incorrect article. That run still feels really good. And most of what he learned in that whole performance, because he is learning when he's trialing, was what I wanted him to learn. It's what I wanted him to practice. On the other hand, I've had some trials, I've had some performances that scored okay, but what my dog learned was pretty mediocre, right? Maybe we got through, he came back with the correct scent article, but he went out to his go out. When I sent him out to do the directed jumping exercise, he went out kind of meh. Or I had to use a second cue to get him to sit on a healing pattern or something like that. So there are a lot of situations where what your dog is practicing in the ring is not really what you want him to learn, but it looks okay on the score sheet. And there's a lot of the reverse as well. And the more we are in testing mode, the more likely we are to focus on the score sheet and ignore those other emotional signals, the increased latency, what the dog is actually learning and rehearsing in that ring environment.